The autumn breeze gently rustled through the curtains as Susan Morgan stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. At 38, she never thought she'd get another chance at love, especially after raising her daughter as a single mom for the past decade. But life had a funny way of surprising you when you least expected it. Her fingers traced the edge of a photo tucked into the mirror's frame, a snapshot from last summer's beach vacation. There she was, laughing with her 15-year-old daughter Jenny and her fiancé Robert Chen, their faces glowing in the golden sunset. The memory of that perfect day brought a smile to her face, even as wedding day jitters threatened to overwhelm her. Susan had built a successful career as an interior designer, transforming empty spaces into beautiful homes for other families, while somehow managing to be there for every one of Jenny's school events. Her clients often joked that she had a magical ability to be in two places at once, but behind her professional success, she'd always felt something was missing. Then, 18 months ago, Robert walked into her design studio, looking for someone to help renovate his real estate office. What started as a simple business meeting over coffee turned into hours of conversation about their shared love of old movies, passion for architecture, and dreams of traveling the world. There was something different about him. The way he listened, really listened, when she talked about her daughter and how he never tried to rush their relationship. "Mom, have you seen my phone charger?" Jenny's voice called from down the hall, pulling Susan back to the present. Her daughter appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her pale blue bridesmaid dress. Something flickered across Jenny's face. Was it concern? But before Susan could ask, her daughter plastered on a smile and hurried over to help with the necklace clasp. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Robert had insisted on handling most of the arrangements, saying Susan deserved her dream wedding. He'd booked the city's most beautiful venue, a restored Victorian mansion with gardens that would be perfect for their intimate ceremony of 100 guests. Everything was falling into place like a fairy tale. But lately, Susan had noticed subtle changes in her daughter's behavior. Jenny, usually bubbling with energy and always ready to share stories about her day, had grown quieter. She spent more time in her room, and her usual playful banter with Robert had all but disappeared. Susan had tried to talk to her about it, but Jenny brushed it off as stress from her upcoming exams. "You look beautiful, Mom," Jenny said softly, meeting her mother's eyes in the mirror. There was something heavy in her voice, something that didn't quite match the occasion's joy. Susan reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you sure everything's okay, sweetie?" she asked, searching her daughter's reflection for clues to her mood. Jenny's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she flinched slightly before pulling away. "Yeah, just wedding day nerves, I guess," Jenny replied, but her eyes were fixed on her phone screen, her fingers tightening around it as if it held some terrible secret. "I should go help Aunt Linda with the flowers." As Jenny hurried from the room, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But she pushed the worry aside, chalking it up to pre-wedding jitters and the natural anxiety that came with such a big change in their lives. After all, tomorrow she would be Mrs. Chen, and their little family of two would grow into something new and beautiful. Looking back at her reflection one last time, Susan touched up her lipstick and straightened her shoulders. She had waited so long for this happiness, for this chance to build a complete family with a man who seemed too good to be true. In just a few hours, she would walk down the aisle toward her future, toward the perfect life she had always dreamed of for herself and her daughter. If only she had known then that sometimes the perfect dream can turn into your worst nightmare, and that the people closest to you might be keeping secrets that could shatter everything you thought you knew about love and trust. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the bridal suite, casting a warm glow on the chaos within. Hair products and makeup brushes covered every surface as Susan sat in front of a large mirror, trying to stay still while her best friend Karen worked on her hair. The room buzzed with excited chatter from her bridesmaids, but Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jenny paced near the window, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the screen, her face growing more troubled with each notification. The beautiful bridesmaid dress she wore seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders, so different from the excitement she'd shown when they first picked it out 3 months ago. "Honey, could you help Aunt Linda with the flower arrangements?" Susan called out, hoping to distract her daughter from whatever was bothering her. Jenny jumped at her mother's voice, nearly dropping her phone. I need to check something first, Jenny mumbled, her fingers flying over the phone's keyboard. The teenager's face had gone pale, and she kept biting her lower lip, a nervous habit she had since kindergarten. Linda, Susan's older sister, exchanged worried glances with Karen. They'd both noticed Jenny's strange behavior over the past few hours. This wasn't typical teenage mood swings. Something was clearly eating at the young girl. "The flowers can wait," Linda said softly, approaching Jenny. "Why don't you sit down for a minute? You look like you could use a break." She reached out to touch Jenny's arm, but the girl pulled away, bumping into a side table and knocking over a vase of roses. Water spilled across the hardwood floor, and Jenny burst into tears. Not the quiet tears of a moody teenager, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere much darker. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she kept repeating, her hands shaking as she tried to mop up the water with nearby tissues. Her phone clattered to the floor, screen facing up, and Linda caught a glimpse of what looked like a message thread before Jenny snatched it back. Susan started to rise from her chair, but Karen gently pushed her back down. "Let me finish your hair first," she insisted, though her eyes were fixed on Jenny. "We've got plenty of time to sort everything out." But time felt like it was slipping away faster than anyone could grasp. The wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m., and it was already past 11. Outside, cars were pulling into the parking lot of the Victorian mansion. Guests would soon be arriving for the pre-ceremony celebration. Through the window, they could see Robert's family members directing the catering staff, everything running like clockwork. He had planned it all so perfectly, almost too perfectly, some might say. His attention to detail had seemed charming during the engagement, but now there was something almost controlling about it. Jenny's phone buzzed again, and this time she let out a small gasp. "I can't," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I just can't let this happen." Linda moved closer to her niece, speaking in a low voice that only Jenny could hear. "Whatever it is, sweetheart, you can tell us. Nothing is more important than family, not even a wedding." The word wedding seemed to break something loose in Jenny. She looked at her mother, still sitting in the styling chair, her hair half done and hope shining in her eyes. The same hope Jenny had seen growing stronger over the past 18 months as Robert wove himself into their lives. "Mom," Jenny's voice cracked. "There's something you need to know about Robert, something really bad." She clutched her phone like a lifeline, tears streaming down her face. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, but I was so scared. I didn't want to ruin everything, but—" The room fell silent. Even the distant sounds of wedding preparations seemed to fade away. Susan turned fully in her chair now, maternal instinct overriding everything else. She'd never seen her daughter look so tormented, so afraid. "What is it, baby?" Susan asked, her own voice trembling. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together, just like we always have." Jenny took a deep, shuddering breath, her fingers hovering over her phone screen. In just a few moments, she would reveal the secret that would turn this perfect wedding day into something none of them could have imagined. The truth that had been hiding behind perfectly planned details and charming smiles was about to shatter their world, and perhaps save them all. Jenny's hands trembled as she unlocked her phone. The bridal suite had grown so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Her mother sat before her, still in her silk robe, half-finished wedding hado forgotten in the heavy moment. "I found these messages 3 weeks ago," Jenny began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't snooping, I promise. I was helping Amy with her history project when the messages popped up on her sister Rebecca's phone." Susan felt her stomach twist into knots. Amy was Jenny's best friend since middle school, and her sister Rebecca was only 17, still in her final year of high school. Something about the way Jenny said this made Susan's maternal instincts flare with warning. "At first, I thought I was seeing things wrong," Jenny continued, turning her phone screen toward her mother. "But then I started paying more attention. The way he would offer to drive Rebecca home from her part-time job at the mall. How he always seemed to know her schedule." Linda, Susan's sister, moved closer to look at the screen, her face draining of color as she read. The messages started innocently enough, casual conversations about college plans and career advice. But as Susan scrolled through, she saw how Robert had slowly steered the conversations in a different direction, becoming more personal, more inappropriate. There's more, Jenny said, swiping to another conversation. Rebecca finally told Amy last week, and Amy told me everything. He's been sending her expensive gifts, telling her to keep them secret. He said, Jenny's voice caught. He said she was mature for her age, not like other teenagers. The room spun around Susan. She thought about all those evening meetings Robert claimed to have, the business calls that always seemed to run late. How he'd insisted on handling all the wedding preparations himself, keeping her so busy with decisions about flowers and tablecloths that she hadn't noticed the changes in her own daughter's behavior. Karen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. That's not all, is it, Jenny? She had known this family for 20 years, had watched Jenny grow up. She could tell there was more weighing on the teenager's conscience. Jenny shook her head, tears falling freely now. Last month, I overheard him on the phone in his office. He thought everyone had left after the dinner party, but I'd gone back to get my jacket. He was talking to someone about property deals, but it wasn't like his normal business calls. She paused, taking a shaky breath. He was laughing about how he'd convinced an elderly couple to sell their house for half its value. He said they were too stupid to check the real market price. Susan's hands flew to her mouth, remembering all the elderly clients Robert claimed to help through his real estate business. He talked so much about protecting seniors from predatory buyers, about making sure they got fair deals for their retirement. I wanted to tell you right away, Jenny continued, her words tumbling out faster now, as if she couldn't hold them back any longer. But he was always there, always watching. And you seemed so happy, Mom. I've never seen you smile so much. I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The weight of her daughter's words pressed against Susan's chest. All those nights Jenny had seemed distant at dinner, all those times she'd made excuses to avoid family outings with Robert, it hadn't been typical teenage rebellion. Her daughter had been carrying this burden alone, trying to protect her mother while struggling with the truth. Linda wrapped her arms around Jenny, holding her close as the girl finally let out all the fear and anxiety she'd been holding in. You did the right thing, sweetheart, she whispered. You're so brave. Susan stood up, her legs unsteady. Through the window, she could see guests starting to arrive, their faces bright with anticipation of the celebration to come. Robert's elderly mother was being helped up the steps, clutching a beautiful gift bag. His business partners were gathering in small groups, champagne glasses already in hand. What do we do now? Karen asked softly, looking at her best friend with concern. The ceremony starts in less than 2 hours. Susan squared her shoulders, a fierce kind of clarity cutting through her shock. She might be wearing a wedding dress today, but first and foremost, she was a mother. And no one, no matter how charming or successful they seemed, was going to hurt her family. Now, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her heart, I'm going to have a very different kind of conversation with my fiancé. The church's antechamber was quiet, a stark contrast to the growing buzz of guests in the main hall. Susan stood in her wedding dress, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. She had asked Linda to bring Robert here, away from the crowd, away from the curious eyes of their guests. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Robert stepped in, his face lighting up at the sight of her. For a moment, Susan almost faltered. He looked so handsome in his tuxedo, so much like the man she thought she'd spend the rest of her life with. Sweetheart, you know it's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, he said, moving toward her with open arms. But Susan took a step back, and something in her expression made him stop. We need to talk about Rebecca, Susan said quietly, watching his face carefully. For just a split second, something flashed in his eyes, panic, maybe, or anger, before his expression smoothed back into confused concern. Rebecca? Amy's sister. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. What about her? Susan pulled out her daughter's phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it up. I've seen the messages, Robert. All of them. The gifts, the secret meetings, everything. The change in his demeanor was instant and chilling. His warm smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. Those messages could be taken out of context, he said, his voice low and controlled. I was just trying to be helpful, mentoring a young person interested in real estate. Mentoring? Susan's voice cracked with disbelief. She's 17 years old. You were grooming her, manipulating her, just like you manipulated those elderly couples you cheated out of their homes. Robert's face hardened. "You don't understand business," he said dismissively. "Sometimes you have to be creative with negotiations. Those old folks got fair market value for their time. Who told you about that anyway?" His eyes narrowed. "Was it your nosy daughter? That girl's been a problem since day one." The way he spoke about Jenny made Susan's blood boil. All the love she thought she had for this man burned away in an instant, replaced by a fierce protective anger. "My daughter," she said, her voice gaining strength, "is the bravest person I know. She saw through your act when all of us adults were too blind to see it." Outside the antechamber, voices grew louder. The wedding coordinator was probably looking for them. It was almost time for the ceremony to begin. Robert seemed to realize this too, and his approach changed. "Look," he said, trying to sound reasonable, "we can work this out. Think about what you're doing. The guests are all here. Everything's paid for. You're going to throw away our future over some misunderstanding." Susan looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how she had missed the signs. The way he always needed to be in control, how he isolated her from her friends with subtle criticisms, his insistence on handling all their finances. "There's no misunderstanding," she said firmly. "The wedding is off. I'm going to walk out there and tell everyone exactly why." Robert's facade cracked completely. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed, stepping closer. "Think about my reputation, my business. You'll ruin everything I've built." "Step back," came a stern voice from the doorway. Linda stood there, with Karen and Jenny right behind her. They must have been worried when Susan took too long. "This is a private conversation," Robert snapped, but Linda didn't budge. "Not anymore, it's not," she said, "and my sister told you to step back." The tension in the room was broken by another figure pushing through the doorway, Robert's younger brother David, his face ash-white. "I heard everything," he said quietly, "and I can't keep quiet anymore." He turned to Susan. "There's more you need to know about my brother. A lot more." Robert's face went from angry to panicked. "David, don't you dare." 3 other cities, David continued, looking straight at Susan. 3 other places where he did the same thing. Get close to vulnerable people, gain their trust, take what he wanted. "I helped cover it up because he's my brother, but I can't let him hurt anyone else." The truth hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy and undeniable. Susan felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She reached up and removed her veil, placing it carefully on a nearby chair. "Karen," she said, her voice steady, "please go tell the guests that there won't be a wedding today." "Linda, call the police. We need to report everything about the real estate fraud." And David, she looked at Robert's brother with genuine compassion. "Thank you for finally telling the truth." Robert stood there, his perfect facade crumbling as his carefully constructed world fell apart. He opened his mouth to speak, but Susan held up her hand. "Save it for the police," she said. Then she turned to her daughter, who was watching everything with tears in her eyes. "Come here, sweetheart. Let's go home." As they walked out together, mother and daughter supporting each other, Susan realized that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from the life you thought you wanted towards something harder but more honest. Today wasn't an ending after all, it was a beginning. The next hour passed in a blur of shocked faces and whispered conversations. As Karen spread the news about the wedding's cancellation, the beautiful Victorian venue became a scene of confused chaos. Guests gathered in small groups, their fancy clothes and gift boxes now seeming out of place in the unfolding drama. David, Robert's younger brother, stood in the garden, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He had asked to speak with Susan privately, and now they sat on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, far from the dispersing crowd. "I should have spoken up sooner," David said, his voice thick with regret. This isn't the first time he's done something like this. He pulled out his phone, showing Susan a series of news articles from different cities. Each one told a similar story. Businesses closed, elderly residents displaced, communities torn apart. 3 years ago, it was a small town in the Midwest, David continued, scrolling through the articles. Robert convinced a whole neighborhood of retirees to sell their homes for a luxury retirement community. The project was never real. He took their money and disappeared before anyone realized what had happened. Susan felt sick to her stomach. How did he get away with it? "He's smart about covering his tracks," David explained. "Different company names, fake documents. And he's good at making people trust him, really good. He paused, looking down at his hands. Our parents, they always made excuses for him, said he was just being a clever businessman. Inside the venue, they could hear Linda talking with the police who had just arrived. Jenny sat with Amy and Rebecca, the three girls giving their statements about Robert's inappropriate behavior. Rebecca's parents stood nearby, their faces a mix of anger and guilt for not noticing what was happening to their daughter. There's something else you should know, David said quietly. Last month, I found some documents in his office. Plans for after the wedding. He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. He was going to convince you to put your house and business in his name. Said it was for tax purposes. Susan's hand flew to her throat, remembering how Robert had been pushing her to discuss estate planning lately. She had thought it was just his usual financial carefulness, but now... The worst part is, David continued, his voice breaking slightly, I watched him do this before. 2 years ago, he was engaged to another woman, a widow with a successful restaurant chain. David stopped, taking a shaky breath. She lost everything. Her business, her home. She had to move in with her sister in another state. A few yards away, the police were now escorting Robert out of the building. His perfect appearance had crumbled, tie askew, hair disheveled, that charming smile replaced by a cold glare. He caught sight of David and Susan sitting together and his face contorted with rage. You think you've won, he shouted across the garden. Good luck proving anything. It's all legal. Every document, every transaction. One of the officers gently but firmly guided him toward the waiting police car. Sir, please keep walking. You have the right to remain silent. Linda hurried over to Susan and David, her face flushed with a mix of anger and relief. The detective wants to talk to you both, she said. Apparently, they've been investigating Robert's real estate dealings for months. They just needed someone to come forward. David stood up, straightening his shoulders. I have files, he said, records of everything he's done over the past 5 years. I've been keeping them, telling myself it was for protection, but really, he looked at Susan with genuine remorse. I was just too scared to do the right thing. Until today. Susan reached out and squeezed his hand. You did do the right thing. Finally, that's what matters now. From across the garden, Jenny came running over. She had changed out of her bridesmaid dress into regular clothes, her face streaked with dried tears, but her eyes clear and determined. Mom, she said, Rebecca's parents want to press charges. The police say, she glanced at David, they say other families might come forward too. Susan pulled her daughter into a tight hug, feeling the trembling in Jenny's shoulders slowly subsiding. Over Jenny's head, she watched as the police car carrying Robert drove away, taking with it all her dreams of a perfect second chance at love. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by people who had chosen truth over silence, Susan realized something important. Sometimes the most unexpected allies emerge from the darkest situations. And sometimes it takes a complete breakdown of the life you planned to show you the strength of the foundations you already had. The next few days unfolded like scenes from a movie nobody wanted to star in. Susan's phone wouldn't stop ringing, filled with messages from concerned friends, local news reporters, and, most surprisingly, strangers with their own stories about Robert's deceptions. Monday morning found Susan sitting in her kitchen, still in her pajamas, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Jenny had insisted on staying home from school, worried about leaving her mom alone. The local newspaper lay on the table between them, its headline screaming, Prominent real estate developer arrested at own wedding. You don't have to read it, Jenny said softly, reaching for the paper, but Susan shook her head. No, I need to know everything, she replied, smoothing out the wrinkled pages. The article was actually fair, focusing more on the pattern of fraud than the personal drama. But it was the online comments that truly caught her attention, dozens of people sharing similar experiences. The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Linda stood on the porch with David, both carrying boxes of files. The detective said these might help with the case, David explained as they spread documents across Susan's dining room table. And there's something else you should see. He opened his laptop and pulled up a social media post that had gone viral overnight. One of Robert's former clients, a retired schoolteacher, had shared her story of nearly losing her home to his schemes. The post had thousands of comments, many from other victims finally finding the courage to speak up. Mrs. Anderson from the flower shop called, Linda added, showing Susan her phone. She says Robert tried to pressure her into selling her store last month, said the area was being rezoned for high-rise apartments. It was all lies. Jenny, who had been quietly listening, suddenly stood up. "Wait here," she said, running upstairs. She returned with a notebook, its pages filled with careful notes and dates. "I started writing things down when I first got suspicious," she explained. "Things he said that didn't add up, times when he made weird phone calls. I thought I was just being paranoid, but—" The doorbell rang again. This time it was Karen, accompanied by Rebecca and her parents. They had just come from meeting with the district attorney. "They think there might be victims in at least 5 different states," Rebecca's father said, his face grim. "The FBI is getting involved." Susan watched as Rebecca hugged Jenny, both girls drawing strength from each other. The teenager who had been targeted by Robert's manipulation was now standing tall, determined to help prevent it from happening to anyone else. More visitors arrived throughout the day. Mrs. Chen, Robert's mother, came to return Susan's engagement ring and apologized through tears for not warning her about her son's past. "I thought he had changed," she whispered. "I wanted so badly to believe he had changed." By evening, Susan's living room had become an informal command center. David coordinated with lawyers, helping piece together the complex web of Robert's fraudulent businesses. Linda organized the growing stack of evidence from other victims. Karen worked on a spreadsheet tracking all the cases, her accounting background proving invaluable. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, Susan realized that sometimes the most painful revelations lead to the most necessary changes. The public fallout wasn't just about exposing one man's crimes. It was about giving voice to those who had been silenced, strength to those who had been weakened, and hope to those who thought they were alone in their struggles. 6 months had passed since the wedding that never was. The maple trees outside Susan's kitchen window were showing their first autumn colors, and the morning air had that crisp feel that meant summer was finally letting go. She sat at her desk, reading through emails from people she now considered extended family. Other survivors of Robert's schemes who had become part of an unexpected support network. "Mom," Jenny called from downstairs. "Don't forget we have that meeting at the community center today." Susan smiled, gathering her papers. What had started as an informal support group in her living room had grown into something much bigger. Together with Linda and Karen, she had established a non-profit organization helping single parents navigate the dating world safely and protect themselves from financial fraud. The kitchen counter still held their half-packed suitcases. Tomorrow, they would leave for that European trip they planned using the refunded wedding venue deposit. But first, they had important work to do. At the community center, familiar faces greeted them. Mrs. Anderson from the flower shop was there, along with Mr. Thompson from the senior center. Rebecca sat with her parents, looking more confident than ever as she prepared to share her story with a new group of teenagers about recognizing manipulation tactics. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a ruined wedding," Susan whispered to Linda as they watched people fill the room. "But look at all the good that's come from it." The good she spoke of wasn't just their advocacy work. In the months since Robert's arrest, his victims had banded together, supporting each other through the legal proceedings. David had become an invaluable ally, using his insider knowledge to help prosecutors unravel his brother's complex web of fraud. Jenny had blossomed too. The quiet, worried teenager who had carried such a heavy secret was now leading peer support groups at her school, helping other young people learn to trust their instincts and speak up when something felt wrong. "Ready to start?" Karen asked, handing out folders to the newcomers. Today's session focused on financial literacy and recognizing red flags in relationships, topics Susan wished she'd known more about before meeting Robert. As she stood to address the group, Susan caught sight of a new face in the back row. An elderly woman clutching a newspaper clipping about Robert's upcoming trial. The woman's hands were shaking slightly, and Susan recognized that look of shame and uncertainty, the same look she'd seen in her own mirror not so long ago. "When I planned my wedding last spring," Susan began, her voice steady and warm, "I thought I was heading toward my happily ever after. Instead, I got something different, something harder but ultimately more valuable. She paused, making eye contact with the new woman, offering a gentle smile of understanding. I learned that real love, whether it's romantic love, family love, or community love, is built on trust and truth. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is admit when we've been fooled and help others avoid the same trap. Jenny stood up to join her mother at the front of the room. Together, they shared their story, not just the dramatic wedding day revelation, but the smaller moments that had led up to it. The subtle red flags, the uncomfortable feelings they'd pushed aside, the importance of listening to that quiet voice of doubt. After the meeting, as they helped stack chairs and clean up, the elderly woman approached them. "I lost my retirement savings to someone like him," she said quietly. "I've been too embarrassed to tell anyone. But hearing your story—" "You're not alone anymore," Jenny told her, pulling up a chair. "That's what we do here. We listen, we support each other, and we get stronger together." Later that evening, as Susan and Jenny finished packing for their trip, they found the old wedding planning notebook buried in a drawer. Instead of bringing back painful memories, it made them laugh. "Remember how he insisted on picking all the flowers himself?" Jenny said, flipping through the pages. Looking back, it was so obvious he was controlling everything. "Well, tomorrow we get to make all our own choices," Susan replied, adding their passports to her carry-on bag. "Which reminds me, what do you think about extending our Paris stay by a few days? There's this amazing art museum you might like." Jenny's face lit up. "Really? But what about the budget?" "I think we can manage it," Susan smiled. "I've learned a lot about financial planning since joining our own support group. Besides, some experiences are worth the investment." As they finished packing, Susan looked around their cozy home, at the wall of photos showing happy moments with true friends and family. The wedding disaster that could have broken them had instead revealed their strength, not just as individuals, but as part of a larger community. Tomorrow, they would board a plane to create new memories, just mother and daughter, exploring the world on their own terms. But they would return to continue their important work, helping others find their voice and their strength. Because sometimes the best endings aren't the fairy tales we're sold, but the real stories we write ourselves, stories of resilience, growth, and the unshakable bond between a mother and daughter who chose truth over illusion and found their own kind of happily ever after.